Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, continuing reading Hegel's proofs on the existence of God. Continuing from where we were last time, we're beginning with the third lecture. So, you should all have the PDF. If not, it's in the text chat. Third lecture. This cat's staring at me and he looks so high. Cats have funny faces sometimes. Third lecture. It has already been remarked that the pretentious assertion of faith, of which we have to speak, is found outside of genuine natural faith. The latter, insofar as it has advanced to cognitive consciousness and accordingly has acquired a consciousness of cognition, accedes to cognitive knowledge with full confidence in it, because it is above all confident of itself, is sure of itself and firmly established within itself. We are rather concerned with faith insofar as it takes up a polemical attitude toward cognitive knowledge and even expresses itself polemically against knowledge in general. It is thus not a faith that opposes itself to another faith, where faith is common to both and therefore content fights against content, but introducing content at once brings knowledge with it. If it were otherwise, the refutation and defense of the truth of religion, would not be carried out with external weapons, which are just as foreign to faith and religion as to knowledge. The faith that rejects knowledge as such is, just because of this, devoid of content. In the first instance, it is to be taken abstractly as faith in general, since it opposes itself to concrete knowledge, to cognitive knowledge without reference to content. As abstract, it is drawn back into the simplicity of self-consciousness. In its simplicity, insofar as it has any feeling at all, it is feeling, and what comprises the content of knowing is the determinacy of feeling. The assertion of abstract faith thus leads immediately to the form of feeling, in which the subjectivity of knowledge entrenches itself as an inaccessible place. Completely tangential, but there's another server I'm part of, and they have a religion channel on it, and I am still far away from having dealt with people who actually believe in the Bible for so long that I had completely forgotten about people disputing stupid things from just citations of the Bible. They're like, this passage says God hates the gays, and then there's other people like, well, if you go back to the original Greek and the original etymologies, in the context of the time, it's not clear. And, it says something. It's kind of a word that came of something about some word, and it was like, it could mean homosexuality. It could also just mean no, it's not that. It could also mean just general. General non-orthodox relationships. So it had that wide variety of things, and I understand what people get. They want to be charitable towards the past, but I don't know where people get this idea that people in the past were that very understanding and deeply concerned about such issues. They were not pro-gay, and it wasn't just gay identity, which is a modern thing. No, it's sex was for procreation, and the enjoyment of one's partners, and that was it.
Unless you're Orthodox, then you can't have pleasure at all.
That too. but they're there's this whole there's these people who just want to clean it up to such an extent that it just doesn't even make any historical sense. Of course the people back then wouldn't give a fuck about this stuff. Even the idea of just sex for pleasure was not, at least in Christianity, was not a thing, mainly because sex is dangerous. You can get pregnant if you're a woman. You give birth, you could possibly die. It was a real thing, so you wouldn't just be fucking around. It wouldn't be considered an acceptable thing at all, no matter what.
Yeah, people did it though.
Oh, they did, but it still wouldn't be something
Yeah, it wasn't
acceptable, let alone
socially accepted. No.
let alone within like the religious doctrines. Anyways, point is, doctrinal religion is stupid. I don't, people who are like, it's like they're still trying to square the circle of like, I'm gay, but the Bible, and I'm like, why are you even a Christian anymore? Like, why do you even care about Christianity? Why do you care about like doctrinal religion at all? Like,
why do you believe in hell?
Yeah, learn some philosophy. Learn what real God is. Anyways, continuing. Both standpoints, faith and feeling, must therefore be briefly indicated, from which their one-sidedness and consequently the untruth of the fashion in which they are asserted to be ultimate and fundamental determinations become apparent. We begin with faith. It starts with the assumption that the nullity of knowledge in regard to absolute truth has been demonstrated. We shall proceed by granting to faith its assumption and by seeing what happens to it then. Faith, immediacy, and mediation. In the first place, if the opposition is conceived of in a wholly general sense as the opposition of faith and knowledge, as one often hears spoken of, then this abstraction must immediately be censored. For faith belongs to consciousness. We know about what we believe. Indeed, we know it with certainty. It is at once apparent that it is absurd to want to separate faith and knowledge in such a general fashion. But faith is now called immediate knowledge, and thus is to be essentially distinguished from mediated and mediating knowledge. Here we leave aside the speculative discussion of this concept in order to remain within the sphere belonging to this sort of assertion. Thus we oppose to this separation, which is asserted to be absolute, the fact that there is no knowledge any more than there is any sensation, representation, and volition, or any activity, property, or condition pertaining to spirit, that is not mediated and mediating. Likewise, there is no object of nature and spirit, be what it may, in heaven or on earth or under the earth, that does not include within itself the quality of mediation as well as of immediacy. Logical philosophy, as if there could be illogical philosophy, presents this as a universal fact, along with this necessity to which we need not here appeal, in all the spheres of thought. In regard to the material sense, whether it belongs to outer or to inner perception, it is admitted that it is finite, that is, that it exists only as mediated through what is other. What of this material itself, but of this material itself, and still more of the higher content of spirit, it will be admitted that it has its determinate quality in categories, and that the nature of its categorial determination is shown in logic to be that of having the indicated element of mediation inseparably within itself. But we pause here to call attention to the wholly universal fact of mediation, regardless of the sense and specificity with which the facts may be understood. Without digressing into examples, we abide by the one object that here lies nearest to us. God is activity, free activity relating to itself and remaining with itself. The fundamental determination in the concept of God and also in every representation of God is that God is God's self, the mediation of God with God's self. If God is defined only as creator, God's activity is taken only as going out of itself, as expanding itself out of itself, as an intuitive producing, without any return into itself. The product is an other than God. It is the world. The introduction of the category of mediation would at once bring with it the meaning that God must be through the mediation of the world. Or at least one could rightly say that God is creator only by means of the world or of what is created. But this would be an empty tautology, for the category what is created is directly implicit in the first category, creator. Moreover, what is created remains, as far as representation is concerned, a world outside of God and other to God, so that God exists beyond the world, apart from it, and in and for God's self. But in Christianity, least of all, do we know God only as creative activity and not as spirit. Rather, what is distinctive for this religion is the explicit consciousness that God is spirit, that God, precisely as God is in and for God's self, relates God's self to God's other, which is called the Son, as to God's self, so that God relates to God's self and God's self as love, essentially as this mediation with God's self. God is indeed creator of the world and is sufficiently defined in this way, but God is more than this. God is the true God in that God is the mediation of God's self with God's self and is this love. Alright, if you there's a bit of something you'll learn in far more detail in the lectures on religion. Faith, then, inasmuch as it has God as the object of its Faith, then, inasmuch as it has God as the object of its consciousness, has this mediation for its object. In like manner, faith, as existing in the individual, only exists through instruction and education, through human instruction and education generally. But even more, let me just read that whole sentence. In like manner, faith as existing in the individual only exists through instruction and education, through human instruction and education generally, but even more through the instruction and education of the Spirit of God. It exists through this process of mediation. But faith, like consciousness in general, this relation of the subject to an object, is also quite abstract, for God or any other thing or content may be its object. So faith and knowledge only exists through the mediation of an object, otherwise it is a matter of an empty identity, a faith in or knowledge of nothing. Makes sense to me. So, as I understand it, the whole point being made here is that faith first posits itself as immediate knowledge. But the problem of immediate knowledge is it can't be immediate. If it was immediate, it wouldn't be knowledge at all, since knowledge is knowledge of an object. But if it has an object, then the object is mediating the knowledge itself, so therefore the immediacy is actually mediated. But conversely, there is to be found here the other fact that, in like manner, nothing exists that is solely and exclusively the product of mediation. If we inquire into what is meant by immediacy, we see that it must exist within itself, without any difference. As such, it is that through which mediation is at once posited. It is simple reference to itself, and thus, in its immediate modality, is merely being. Now, all knowledge, immediate or immediate, and indeed everything else, at all events is, and that it is itself the least and most abstract thing that one can say of anything. Even if it is only subjective like faith or knowledge, it is the predicate being applied. The predicate being applies to it, just as being applies to the object that is only in faith and knowledge. This is a very simple insight. Yet because of this simplicity, one may be impatient with philosophy as one departs from the fullness and warmth that is faith and passes over to such abstractions as being and immediacy. But in fact, this is not the fault of philosophy. Rather, it is the assertion of faith and immediate knowledge that takes its stand on these abstractions. In the claim that faith is not mediated knowledge lies the entire substance of the matter and the verdict passed upon it. But we come also to the content, or rather, we come only to the relations of a content to knowledge. We note additionally that immediacy in knowledge, which is faith, has a further quality. Faith knows that in which it believes, not merely generally or in the sense of having a notion or information about it, but rather with certainty. The nerve of faith resides in certainty. Here we immediately encounter a further distinction, that of truth from certainty. We know very well that much has been known and is known as certain, which is nonetheless not true. To take a trivial example, people have long enough known it to be certain, and millions still know it to be certain, that the sun goes around the earth. And what is more, the Egyptians believed and knew for certain that Apis was a great or the greatest god, while the Greeks believed the same about Jupiter. The Hindus still know for certain that the cow is God, while other inhabitants of India, the Mongols and various peoples, know that a man, the Dalai Lama, is God. No one denies that this sort of certainty is expressed and asserted. An individual may well say, I know something for certain, I believe it, it is true. But at the same time, everyone else must be allowed to say the same thing, for everyone is I, everyone knows for certain. This unavoidable admission expresses the fact that this knowing with certainty, this abstraction can have the most diverse and opposed contents, and the proof of the contents must lie in this assurance of certain knowing, of faith. But which individual will come forward and say, only what I know and know with certainty is true. What I know with certainty is true because I know it for certain. Truth stands eternally over against mere certainty, and neither certainty nor immediate knowledge nor faith decides what is truth. Christ directed his apostles and friends away from the truly most immediate and visible certainty that they derived from his immediate presence, away from his own sayings and the words of his mouth that they heard with their ears and apprehended with their senses and hearts. He directed them away from such a faith and such a source of faith to the truth into which they were to be led in the future by the Spirit. For the attainment of anything beyond this highest certainty derived from the just indicated source, nothing is available but the content itself. Alright, so I suppose that first section is mainly about the faith of the senses. Transition to feeling. Insofar as it is defined to be immediate as opposed to mediated knowledge, faith reduces itself to the abstract formalism mentioned above. This abstraction makes it possible not only to designate as faith my sensible certainty that I have a body and that there are things outside me, but also to deduce or prove from this what the nature of faith is. But we would do great injustice to what in the religious sphere is called faith if we were to see it in only this abstraction. Faith ought rather to be full of substance. It ought to be a content, a genuine content. It ought to be far removed from such a content as the sensible certainty that I have a body and that sensible things surround me. It ought to contain truth of quite a different sort and from quite a different sphere than just mentioned, the truth of finite things of sense. The orientation to formal subjectivity described above must therefore find even faith as such too objective, for the latter always has to do with the representations of a content, a knowledge of a content, a state of conviction about it. The extreme form of the subjective, in which the shape of the content and the representation and knowledge of it have vanished, is that of feeling. We cannot therefore avoid speaking of it too. Moreover, it is what is asked for in our time, not in a naive way, but as the result of the culture and deriving from the factors already alluded to. Oh, well, that was a short lecture. On to the fourth lecture. And I didn't say anything because I don't see that there is much of anything to say about abstract faith. It's a pretty simple concept. What Hegel says is pretty spot on for it, so it seemed pretty clear to me. Fourth lecture, feeling. As has been shown in the preceding lecture, the form of feeling is closely related to mere faith as such. It is the still more intensive withdrawal of self-consciousness into itself, the development of the content into a mere determinacy of feeling. Religion must be felt. It must exist in feeling. Otherwise it is not religion. Faith cannot exist without feeling. Otherwise it is not religion. This must be acknowledged to be true, for feeling is nothing other than my subjectivity in its simplicity and immediacy. I myself has this existing personality. If I have religion only as a representation, and if faith is certainty about these representations, then the representational content is before me. It is still an object over against me. It is not yet identical with me as a simple self. I am not so penetrated by it that it constitutes my qualitative determinateness. The innermost unity of the content of faith with me is requisite in order that I should have substance, its substance. Thus it is my feeling. Humans should hold nothing in reserve for themselves vis-a-vis religion, for it is the innermost region of truth. Thus religion should occupy not only this still abstract I, which even as faith is yet knowledge, but also the concrete I in its simple personality, which comprehends all of the I within itself. Feeling is this inwardly undivided inwardness. So, I mean, that's a pretty straight up point. Religious faith is a feeling faith. I think there's a pretty common understanding. Not doubt anybody would dispute that. But something that could be said about this is that this creates certain problems about the concept of God in certain standpoints. Deism, for example, has the concept of God, but it's not religious in that there is no conviction, there is no faith, there is no feeling to that. There is no sense of connection to that creator, the demiurge, whatever you want to call it. This is also an accusation that some people make at certain standpoints of God, particularly the so-called philosopher's God, in which it is deemed that one cannot really have a religious relation to that. This is why some people claim that Spinoza was an atheist. I mean, after all, the God in his system is not a personality. You don't have a personal relationship to them. They don't give a fuck about you. You don't have to give a fuck about them. And so people are like, well, then it's can't be taken as a religious standpoint. I don't think so. I think that the fact that Spinoza speaks a lot about blessedness, about one's understanding of God being necessary for one's own happiness and capacity to endure in the world, to exist in the world, and be efficacious in it. And that this is not merely an instrumental thing, but really it's just it's an end in itself. Just knowledge of God it brings you to a state of blessedness, and that is an internal feeling. I would say it's not just an intellectual understanding. What is it? I think Heidegger complains about the philosopher's gods and in all its forms, saying that that it's not really God. It's not something that you pray to. It's not something you feel any personal connection to. Now, certainly Heidegger probably felt no connection to that, and yet I think Heidegger definitely seemed to deify being, despite how he didn't want to say it that way. The way he seemed to treat it was very religious. Anyways, that's an aside. Continuing. Feeling is, however, understood to have the characteristic of being something singular, of lasting for a single moment, just as one thing in alternation with another exists after or alongside the other. But the heart signifies the all-embracing unity of the feelings in regard to both their quantity and their duration. The heart is the fundamental ground that contains with itself and preserves the essential nature of feelings from the fleetingness of their successive appearance. In this, their unbroken unity, for the heart expresses a simple pulse of living spirituality, religion is able to penetrate the diverse contents of feelings and becomes for them the substance that holds, masters, and rules them. But this brings us at once to the reflection that feeling and heart as such are only one aspect, while the determinate forms of feeling and heart are the other aspect. And thus we must at once go further and say that religion is no more true because it is believed and known immediately and for certain than it is because it exists in feeling or in the heart. All religions, even the most false and unworthy, exist in our feelings and hearts along with those that are true. There are feelings that are unethical, unjust, and godless just as much as there are feelings that are ethical, just, and pious. Out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, slander, etc. In other words, that there are not evil but good thoughts does not depend on their being in the heart and coming out of it. It is a matter of the specific form that the feeling which is in the heart has. This is a truism so trivial that one hesitates to give expression to it, but it is part of our culture to carry the analysis of representations even to the length of questioning and denying what is most simple and most commonly received. To that shallow sort of this disenlightenment that vainly promotes its boldness, it appears meaningless and unseemly to recall trivial truths, as to take an example that may be here once again be brought to mind, that the human being is distinguished from the animal by thought but shares feeling with it. If feeling is religious feeling, then religion is its determinate form. If feeling is evil and wicked, then evil and wickedness are its determinate form. It is its determinate quality that forms the content for consciousness, or thought in the terms used above. Feeling is had because of its had content. The heart because of its evil thoughts. Feeling is the common form for the most varied kinds of content. Thus, just as little as immediate certainty can it serve as a justification for any of its determinate qualities. Feeling makes itself known as a subjective form, as something that is in me, just as I am the subject of something. This form is what is simple, what remains equal to itself in all diversity of content. Thus it is intrinsically indeterminate, the abstraction of my singularized existence. By contrast, the determinacy of feeling is initially difference in general, being unlike another, being manifold. This determinacy must, therefore, be explicitly distinguished from the general form whose determinacy it is, and regarded on its own account. It has the shape of the content, but which must be regarded on its own merits and judged on its own account. On these merits depends the merit of the feeling. The content must be true in advance, independently of feeling, just as religion is true on its own account. Religion is what is necessary and universal within itself, the thing that religion is about, that develops itself into a kingdom of truths and of laws, as well as into a kingdom of the knowledge of these truths and their final ground, God. So basically, feels ain't reals. Hegel was ahead of the curve by, 250 years.
$50? Yeah. That was before he was born.
Yeah, he lived in the 1800s, 200 years, same thing.
250 years would be 1770. He wasn't even born yet.
1770?
Yeah.
Now,
Well, okay, 1768, but I rounded down by 2. He was born in 1770.
Alright, yeah.
Yeah.
Still in the ballpark.
This... Well, okay, let's stop arguing. Just thought it was funny you were going that far back. 150 maybe.
Alright, I shall indicate only briefly the consequences of elevating immediate knowledge and feeling as such into a principle. It is the very concentration that brings up... it is the very concentration that brings with it simplification, abstraction, and indeterminateness for the content. Thus they both reduce the divine content, be it religious as such or legal and moral, to a minimum, to what is most abstract. With this, the determination of the content becomes arbitrary, for in that minimum there exists nothing determinate. This is an important consequence, theoretically as well as practically, principally the latter. Reasons are still necessary for the justification of intention and action. Thus, argumentation must be very untrained and unskilled if it does not know how to assign good reasons for what is arbitrary. Another aspect of the situation brought about by the withdrawal into immediate knowledge and feeling concerns the relationship between human beings, their spiritual community. The objective, the thing that religion is about, is what is universal in and for itself, and thus it is for all. As what is most universal, it is implicitly thought as such, and thought is the common ground. People who betake themselves to feeling, to immediate knowledge, to their own representations or thoughts, lock themselves up, as I have said elsewhere, into their own particularity and break off any community with others. They have to be left alone. But this kind of feeling and heart lets us see more closely into feeling and heart. Restricted to such a principle, the consciousness of a content degrades it to its own determinate form. It maintains itself essentially as self-consciousness, to which this determinacy adheres. The self is for consciousness the object that it sets before itself, the substance that has the content only as an attribute or predicate in it, so that the content is not the independent element in which the subject suspends itself. Okay, just a comment on this thing. As what is most universal, religion is implicitly thought as such, and thought is the common ground. You don't commonly hear this, mainly because most people don't commonly think about what the original term of religion means. Now, there is some controversy as to exactly what it means but all the possible meanings of religion have something to do with linking, of uniting.
Mm-hmm. Think of the word ligament.
Yeah. And so what could be the most universal link other than thought itself? Literally, its form is universal, and the capacity of it to be accepted by everyone, insofar as they think, is also universal. If your religion is based on some arbitrary doctrines of revelation, well, not everybody will accept that because they have their own revealed doctrines. They're like, well, my revealed doctrine is this, and I feel it's right, and my book says it's right. It must be right, so you're wrong. I don't accept your positions. And therefore, what happens is exactly what Hegel says, that people close themselves off. So rather than relinking people, it breaks people apart. And if people are broken apart, the connection to God, you can sure bet your sweet ass that it too is broken apart. Continuing. The subject is itself in this way a fixed condition, which has been called the life of feeling. In the irony, so called, that is connected with it, the I is abstract only in relation to itself. As self-distinguished from the content, it stands as pure consciousness of itself, separated from the content. In the life of feeling, the subject exists to a greater extent in the above-mentioned identity with the content. It is a determinate consciousness within it, and remains as this I, object and end to itself. As the religious I, it is an end to itself. This I is object and end to itself as such in the expression, for example, that I am blessed. And insofar as this blessedness is brought about by faith in the truth, the I is filled with truth and penetrated by it. Filled in this way with yearning, it is unsatisfied within itself. But this yearning is that of religion, and so it is satisfied in having this yearning within itself. In yearning, it has the subjective consciousness of itself and of itself as the religious self. Carried beyond itself only in this yearning, it is just in yearning that it preserves itself and the consciousness of being satisfied, its satisfaction with itself. Okay, I think I got to reread that whole paragraph. Going back up to slightly before the end of the prior page. But this kind of feeling in heart lets us see more closely into feeling in heart. Restricted to such a principle, the consciousness of a content degrades it to its own determinate form. It maintains itself essentially as self-consciousness, to which this determinacy inheres, the determinacy of feeling. The self is for consciousness the object that it sets before itself, the substance that has the content only as an attribute or predicate in it, so that the content is not the independent element in which the subject suspends itself. The subject is itself in this way a fixed condition which has been called the life of feeling. Okay, I'm not sure why this distinction is being made here. So we have feeling. We have the breakup of the spiritual community. People will take themselves to feelings, immediate knowledge, their own representations of thoughts, lock themselves up, as I have said elsewhere, into their own particularity and break off any community with others. They have to be left alone. Restricted to such a principle, the consciousness of a content degrades it to its own determinate form. It maintains itself essentially as self-consciousness, to which this determinacy inheres. The self is for consciousness the object that itself sets before itself, the substance that has the content only as an attribute or predicate in it. Okay, I'm not seeing how we're going from feeling to the split of self-consciousness and feeling as an attribute or a predicate. I can understand we went from abstract certainty and faith, which is just the certainty of the faith of the senses. It's just the is of anything. Then we went to the specificity of the subjective pole of faith, which is feeling, which is the determinate form of faith. But then I don't know how we make the move from feeling as a determinate form to consciousness, self-consciousness, and feeling as an attribute of self-consciousness.
I think it might be that because consciousness is awareness of an object, the object of feeling being one's own object, so to speak, is self-consciousness. So the object is its I. So inner feeling is the determinate form, is the I of self-consciousness.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it maintains itself essentially as self-consciousness, to which this determinacy inheres. The self is for consciousness the object that it sets before itself, the substance that has the content only as an attribute or predicate in it, so that the content is not the independent element in which the subject suspends itself. The subject is itself in this way a fixed condition which has been called the life of feeling. In the irony that is connected with it, the I is abstracted only in relation to itself. As self-distinguished from the content, it stands as pure consciousness of itself, separated from the content. In the life of feeling, the subject exists to a greater extent in the above-mentioned identity with the content. It is a determinate consciousness within it, and remains as this I, object and end to itself. As the religious I, it is an end to itself. This I is object and end to itself. As such, in the expression, for example, that I am blessed, and insofar as this blessedness is brought about by faith in the truth, the I is filled with truth and penetrated by it. Filled in this way with yearning, it is unsatisfied within itself. But this yearning is that of religion, and so it is satisfied in having this yearning within itself. In yearning, it has the subjective consciousness of itself and of itself as the religious self. Carried beyond itself only in the yearning, it is just in yearning that it preserves itself and the consciousness of being satisfied and satisfaction with itself. Okay, so I'm... we're on page 94 PDF, Spirit, and those of you who came afterwards. Okay, so we have faith as feeling. Feeling is the object of that consciousness, but since it is taken as... There is a certain element in which the I involves itself in that feeling, but does not fully fall into it, so it remains determinately distinct. So therefore the split between self-consciousness and the feeling itself. But since there is there isn't a full distinction, and feeling as such is what is religious here, because it's not yet a feeling of God, but feeling itself is taken to be the feeling of religion. In the life of feeling, the subject exists to a great extent. The above-mentioned identity with the content is the determinate consciousness within it and remains as this I, object and end to itself. As the religious I, it is an end to itself. This I is object and end to itself as such. In the expression, for example, that I am blessed, and insofar as this blessedness is brought about by faith in the truth, the I is filled with truth and penetrated by it. So, insofar as I am blessed because I have faith in the truth. This object of mine is what I have faith in. The faith of it is the verification of its truth. It is a feeling, therefore I am blessed. And, filled with truth. And because I am blessed, I am filled with truth, penetrated by it. Filled in this way with yearning, it is unsatisfied with itself, but this yearning is that of religion, and so it is satisfied in having this yearning within itself. And yearning has a subjective consciousness of itself and of itself as the religious self. Okay, yeah. What you said earlier was right, Rain. It's through the feeling because it is identified to a significant extent with the self, becomes a mirror of self-consciousness. And then also because it is particularly a religious feeling, regardless of what it is, even when it is a negative feeling, it is affirmed positively. So, you have a yearning, but yearning is that which is the object of faith, or signals the object of faith. Therefore the truth, and therefore one must be satisfied with yearning, because it is the religious feeling itself. But this inwardness also contains the most opposed condition, that of the unhappiest sense of a rupture on the part of those who are pure in heart. When I hold fast to myself as this particular and abstract I, and compare my particular impulses, inclinations, and thoughts with what ought to fill me, I can sense that this opposition is a painful contradiction within me, an opposition that becomes permanent because I have this subjective myself in view as my end, and am concerned only with myself as myself. It is just this fixed reflection that prevents me from being filled by the substantial content, the thing that religion is about. For it is in this thing that I forget myself. In becoming absorbed into it, reflection upon myself disappears of itself. I am defined as subjective only in opposition to this thing which remains with me through my self-reflection. This thing constitutes my end. In keeping myself outside it, my highest turns away from attentiveness to it and back to myself. Thus I unceasingly empty myself and continue in a condition of emptiness. This hollowness that attaches to the highest end of the individual, to pious striving and concern about the well-being of the soul, has led to the most horrible manifestations of a powerless reality, ranging from the quiet sorrow of a loving heart to the soul suffering of despair and madness, more so in earlier ages than in recent times, when satisfaction in the yearning has rather gained an upper hand over the sense of rupture, and has produced in the soul contentment and even irony. Such unreality of the heart is not only emptiness, but also narrowness of heart. What fills it is its own formal subjectivity. It has this I as its object and end. Only the universal that subsists in and for itself is expansive, and the heart widens itself within itself only insofar as it enters into the universal and expands into this content, which is a religious as well as an ethical and legal content. Love is, as such, the heart's abandonment of its limitation to its own particular point, and its reception of the love of God is the reception of the unfolding of God's Spirit, which comprehends all true content within itself and absorbs into its objectivity what is peculiar to the heart. Subjectivity, which is for the heart itself a one-sided form, is surrendered in this content, a surrender wherein it is driven to throw off its subjectivity. This is the drive to act in general, or more strictly speaking, it is the drive to take part in the action of the content that belongs to the divine power and authority that subsists in and for itself, and is therefore absolute. It is this that constitutes the reality of the heart, a reality that is indivisibly both inner and outer. God damn, he has a penchant for writing long-ass paragraphs. I think I gotta reread that because didn't quite catch what was going on. Starting from the top of that paragraph. But this inwardness also contains the most opposed condition, that of the unhappiest sense of rupture on the part of those who are pure in heart. When I hold fast to myself as this particular and abstract I, and compare my particular impulses, inclinations, and thoughts with what ought to fill me, I can sense that this opposition is a painful contradiction within me, an opposition that becomes permanent because I have this subjective myself in view as my end and am concerned only with myself as myself. To the opposition of the self with intuitions and feelings, it is just this fixed reflection that prevents me from being filled by the substantial content, the thing that religion is about. For it is in this thing that I forget myself, and becoming absorbed into it, reflection upon myself disappears of itself. So insofar as I don't hold my feelings to be true to the object of my faith, they are not what they ought to be. Because of that, I fail to have faith. Because I'm constantly, I'm in a contradiction between that content, which should be my content. And then when I allow that content to finally enter into me, the opposition disappears. Because I'm no longer constantly opposing my self-consciousness and my feelings. Rather, my self-consciousness and my feelings are operating as one. Or rather, consciousness and feelings operate as one. I am defined as subjective only in opposition to this thing, which remains with me through my self-reflection. Okay. So I'm defined as subjective only in opposition to this thing, the thing is feeling, which remains with me through my self-reflection. So this seems to be stating that I'm only a subject while I am self-conscious, but not if I'm not. This thing constitutes my end. In keeping myself outside it, my interest turns away from attentiveness to it and back to myself. Thus I unceasingly empty myself and continue in a condition of emptiness. This hollowness that attaches to the highest end of the individual, to pious striving and concern about the well-being of the soul, has led to the most horrible manifestations of powerless reality, ranging from the quiet sorrow of a loving heart to the soul suffering of despair and madness, more so in earlier ages than in recent times, when satisfaction in the yearning has rather gained an upper hand over the sense of rupture and has produced in the soul contentment, even irony. Okay, so we had the we had the development of determinate feeling to the specifications of the opposition to self-consciousness and feelings. This causes the rupture, which is an emotional pain. It is what in the phenomenology of spirits called the unhappy consciousness. And because, at least in the Christian religion, there is a constant impetus to care about the status of my soul, I can never fully let myself go into the object which ought to fill me in religious feeling, which are my feelings, mainly because I'm constantly having to reflect upon myself and judge whether these feelings that I have are actually the feelings that I ought to have. So when I let myself go into my feelings, the opposition disappears, but I also disappear as a subject because I am not self-reflecting, and therefore I'm, in a way, letting go of my responsibility to care for my soul, and therefore I'm constantly being pulled back into myself, with myself as self-conscious, as an object, away from my feelings, and therefore all constantly in opposition to religious feeling. Does that sound right to you guys? Does that seem to be what's going on here?
My sense was that the object shifts in the yearning, where it's supposed to be truth or God, what have you, the most universal and expansive. And so insofar as self-conscious feeling is to remain immediately bound up in itself, it must be at odds with this, and so it constitutes a yearning. What else? And so that yearning oscillates between a satisfaction of it as well as a reinstatement of the yearning. At one moment it's satisfied with yearning, because actually I forget how that worked.
Well, it says, carried beyond itself only in this yearning, it is just in yearning that it preserves itself in the consciousness of being satisfied, its satisfaction with itself.
I'm still trying to figure out how to use this app. Do you have a video with the text up, Antonio, or are you just doing video or audio right now?
I'm just doing audio. Can you not use the PDF? It's in the...
Yeah, I tried opening it to see where we were, and then it opened up in Safari, and then I was bouncing back and forth. But anyway, I really like what we're reading here. This is kind of right up my with what I've recently been studying. But it sounds like I've been reading the lectures on the philosophy of spirit, and when he talks about like satisfaction, it happens at the very end of the section on subjective spirit in the lectures. And he's kind of tying in here, and he mentions a lot about the drives. So I think what he's trying to say here is like this small self has to let go of its like particular drives to get this universal sort of emptying of itself with objectivity, and then subjectivity and objectivity become one, and that's what blessedness is. And that's where like you're letting go of yourself to gain your greater self. And that's what the ultimate satisfaction is. It's like even better than happiness, or it's the true eudaimonia.
Yeah, that's certainly related, but at this point, since we're just, he's developing the simple forms of faith, we're at the point in which we have faith of feeling. I think that it makes sense that with feeling as such, we have that because feeling is also an object of consciousness, necessarily creates a division of the opposition of consciousness, where self-conscious and feeling are necessarily led to opposition. Then this creates this issue of the unhappy consciousness, the unhappy sense of rupture on the part of those who are of impure heart. When I hold fast to myself as this particular and abstract I, and compare my particular impulses, inclinations, and thoughts with what ought to fill me, I can sense that this opposition is a painful contradiction within me, an opposition that becomes permanent because I have this subjective myself in view as my end and am concerned only with myself as myself.
I think he's pointing out a perversity where, because what one is supposed to have is their object, God or what have you, in recognizing that one does not possess it, one is in the position of yearning, but thereby they're oriented towards their proper object, and so their actual lack is satisfying to them. So it's like self-enjoying the abandonment, so to speak, and so they're actually becoming satisfied with themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. It is just this fixed reflection that prevents me from being filled by substantial content, the thing that religion is about, for it is in this thing that I forget myself and becoming absorbed into it. Reflection upon myself disappears of itself. So here feeling would be, he talks about satisfaction with itself at the prior paragraphs, and so it does seem to make sense to me what you're saying, that this might just be a form of a reversed perversion. At first it's a feeling, but the feeling becomes a roundabout way to just become self-satisfied with our abstract self.
Yeah, he says, this thing constitutes my end, in keeping myself outside of it. My interest turns away from the attentiveness to it and back to myself. Thus I unceasingly empty myself and continue in a condition of emptiness. So it actually turns its own self into its end via a lack. This hollowness that attaches to the highest end of the individual, to pious striving and concern about the well-being of the soul, has led to the most horrible manifestations of a powerless reality, ranging from the quiet sorrow of a loving heart to the soul suffering of despair, and madness more so in the earlier ages than in recent times, when satisfaction in the yearning has rather gained an upper hand over the sense of rupture and has produced in the soul contentment or even irony. Yeah, so insofar as we become contented with that distance, we become perverse.
Okay, so then, yeah, this makes sense now. This is why he first mentions blessedness. Blessedness would be just the immediate identity of the feeling with us, and then this yearning would be its opposite, in which the distinction between us and the object of religious desire is made.
Yeah, it's the ought. It's the logical ought that prevents genuine infinite from happening.
Okay, continuing. When we have thus distinguished between the heart that is not preoccupied with itself, not preoccupied because it is deeply absorbed in the thing that religion is about, and the heart that is preoccupied with reflection upon itself, we find that the distinction concerns the heart's relationship to the substantial content. So long as the heart remains within itself and thus outside the content, it stands by its own doing in an external and continual relationship to the content. This connection, which leads the heart to declare what is just and lay down the law from its own feeling, has already been mentioned. To the objectivity of action, that is, to action that originates in the truly substantial content, subjectivity opposes feeling, and to this content and rational cognition of it, it opposes immediate knowing. Here, however, we put aside further consideration of action and remark simply that it is precisely the substantial content, the laws of justice and ethical life, the commandments of God, that is by its nature the intrinsically universal, and therefore has its root and foundation in the region of thought. If sometimes the laws of justice and ethical life are regarded merely as commandments of an arbitrary God, which means in fact an irrational God, it would take us too far afield to start here. Rather, it is rational cognition that constitutes the establishment, investigation, and conviction of the subject regarding the truth of the principles that ought to serve as the foundation of action, inasmuch as the heart that is not preoccupied with itself is to make them its own, be its insight still so undeveloped as any pretension on its part to independence so foreign to it that it reaches the principles rather by way of authority. The part of the heart where such principles are implanted is but the place where consciousness thinks, for the principles are themselves the thoughts of action and are inherently universal. This heart cannot therefore offer any opposition to the development of what is its own objective ground, any more than it can to the development of its own truths, which first appear in themselves as theoretical truths of its religious faith. But this, as its possession of truth and its intensive inwardness, is already in the heart only through the mediation of education, which has asserted its influence on its thought and knowledge as well as its volition, so to a greater degree are the further developed content and the transformation of the heart's sphere of representations, which are indigenous to this abode, into the conscious form of thought immediating immediated knowledge. And a fourth lecture. Let me go back to the middle of that prior big paragraph, because there was a transition to action there. Starting somewhere in the middle there, such unreality of the heart is not only emptiness but also narrowness of heart. What fills it its own own formal subjectivity. It has its eyes, its object and end. Only the universal that subsists in and for itself is expansive, and the heart widens itself within itself only insofar as it enters into the universal and expands into this content, which is a religious as well as an ethical and legal content. It's a pretty good link to as to how religious feeling, religious faith, which then transforms into rational conviction and faith, naturally of its own impetus leads to ethical and legal determinations. Love is as such the heart's abandonment of its limitation to its own particular point, and its reception of the love of God is the reception of the unfolding of God's Spirit, which comprehends all true content within itself and absorbs into its objectivity what is peculiar to the heart. So feeling aligns with the rational universal. Subjectivity, which is for the heart itself a one-sided form, is surrendered in this content, a surrender wherein it is driven to throw off its subjectivity. This, I think, is in the sense of rights and duties. Thus is the drive to act in general, or more strictly speaking, it is a drive to take part in the action of the content that belongs to the divine power and authority that subsists in and for itself and is therefore absolute. It is this that constitutes the reality of the heart, a reality that is indivisibly both inner and outer. Okay, so this is a quick argument for the doctrine of deeds, which Protestantism abandoned as opposed to Catholicism. Except I think
what do you mean
the
by
reason
that?
With Catholicism, faith is not enough. Like just merely an affirmation of I believe in Jesus doesn't get you into heaven. You have to actually do good deeds as well. And Hegel does have arguments against that doctrine in the philosophies of religion. But the reasoning is that because God couldn't possibly be interested in, if you take that standpoint, God wouldn't be possibly interested in any finite things, because all finite things are going to have some measure of evil in them anyways. So any good deed, you might do good deeds, which for whatever reason end up having bad consequences, but you can't know that.
Very Lutheran of Hegel.
Yeah. But nonetheless, there is an impetus towards actions. Like, real faith will not leave you with a mere statement of faith.
It goes both ways. Like, he says both things. He says, deeds aren't enough either. Like, faith alone isn't enough without deeds, but deeds alone without faith is just as empty. Like, if you just go to church and you do the motions, but you don't actually care in your heart, that's just as bad as the one-sidedness of what I just read over this in the philosophy of spirit, he says that's theoretical spirit. It's the spirit of the ignorant, and that the real Hegelian that embraces real spirit has to do both. It has to have theoretical spirit and then the actualization of that through the will, which is practical spirit. And a lot of these Hegel groups are missing the practical side a lot. And it's just really great for us to cover this section where he says, no, real spirit actually does both. You have to actualize your faith. You have to get theoretical into the world, and that's what the ethical life is. That's how you go from morality to the ethical sphere, and then when you formalize that, that's when you get like this awesome state of blessedness, and then you participate as like a civil servant in that.
Yeah, that's the transition to state life, ethical substance.
Yeah,
where just living in a state and doing your duty and trusting people basically like doing stuff you have to do basically counts as the unity of theory and praxis, so to speak.
Yeah, but it's not like it's an external thing. It's not like you are like a slave to the state. You have to understand your duty. If you don't understand it, like if you can't self-determine it, then that's just as bad. You actually have to know as a citizen why you're doing what you're doing. And the universal nature of it is part of the whole. And that's where you get the real theoretical and the practical on the individual level and the universal level. And that's like the true blessedness. That's when the citizens are respected as autonomous agents, but their autonomy leads back to caring about everybody else as if everybody else was them. You know, it's like the second commandment of Christianity. Love thy neighbor like yourself. Like he meant that, you know, possibly literally, like you have to have self-recognition with everybody in the state, and you have to understand the logic that's behind all their identities so that you can have like this super empathy with them, which leads to when you have that empathy immediately, like it happens, you don't have to think about it. It's like you have it inside of you. That's what love is that immediacy.
No, for Hegel, you don't have that kind of love for every other individual in the state. It's a dutiful thing. It's a sense of duty towards the state as a whole.
Yeah, but when you read the state carefully, like what he says about the state is, you know, when people, the stereotypes that Hegel, you know, facilitated or supported, you know, fascism or totalitarianism because he advocates for the state, right? But the reality is when you go and read, I think somewhere in the philosophy of right, he actually says the duty, like the purpose of the institutions of the state are to protect the individual. And when he says that directly, he's directly going to the other side of the dialectic and saying, no, you need to have individual rights. You need to protect people.
For Hegel, the state can suspend your rights, like in wartime and stuff like that, because it is the whole, so to speak. And you as a particular person only have the being that you have in and through it. And so the state itself is what is important to be maintained. Individuals are technically
expendable. I don't think that's what he said.
In a certain like insofar as you need the people for there to be a state, yes, they're important. But insofar as you as a particular person are needed, that's expendable because
no, my friend, I think you got it wrong. Hegel directly says that the individual is infinitely valuable. That's why Christianity is the ultimate religion, is because, you know, Jesus came along and did something that nobody else was doing at the time, which he says, you know, not only does the king and everybody else go to heaven because they're valuable, and not only does the nobleman also go to heaven, but everybody goes, and not for any particular reason. It's just because they're self-consciousness. You know, just because you are self-consciousness, your reason, that makes you infinitely valuable. And that's why the end of slavery and all these types of things are supposed to come with Christianity, and you're supposed to be with the poor. And Hegel even says, you know, in the philosophy of right, he says, you know, what about the rabble? What about the poor? And he says, yeah, maybe the poor will always be with you, but if you are in a more privileged position in the state, you should make it easier on them. He says, when you get the rabble out of the poor, it's because you're doing something wrong in the state. And he's showing direct empathy and direct care for even the lowest members of society, that they're not just expendable. He's saying that's something that's gone wrong in the state. You're not doing it right. So when you're doing the state right, subjectivity and objectivity become one. So the individual is infinitely protected and valuable, and they're allowed to self-determine at the rate that's valuable for them. But it also serves the universal, the state, the law.
The individual's infinite value is that they form the state.
No, I think it's that they're self-conscious.
As just individual, you're technically expendable in certain respects.
All right. As interesting as this is, I'm still recording, so I'll end the recording here. We ended with a fixed lecture at the beginning. Next time we'll continue. So for those of you listening, hopefully you enjoyed it. See you around.